And I'm going to call upon our first speaker for the day, Father David Smith. His title is Repentance, Restitution, and a Firm Purpose of Amendment, a Christian response to the genocide of Native Americans that the Christian community caused. Father David Smith is a former theologian and professor at the St. Thomas University in St. Paul, and he's been all over the world practically seeing where injustice occurs, and we're glad to have him on our program and we're anxious to hear about what he has to say about how we treated the Native Americans. So please welcome Father David Smith.
So I think I'm going to need help to switch these slides from one to another. So there's somebody at. I just want to get this out of your line of sight, and also so I can read. Okay, now, if you have a little trouble reading or you can't quite keep up, I have about 22 copies of the actual text here that'll be available for those who are especially interested afterward. There's not enough to go around, but those you should be able to follow as you go along, but this is for later. I also have 10 discs, and on the disc is a complete PowerPoint plus a copy of this written text. So you can take one or the other, the disc or the printed form, and I'll leave them up here. So this is the outline of the talk. The first question, of course, is how is it that a Christian community could ever have allowed this? And all of these one could go into great detail with, but this one, first of all, is to say that there are psychopaths, they do exist, and there is imperialism, that is, psychopaths wanting to control the world, and for most people who are not psychopaths and are not imperialists, they really don't think they have the power to do much about it. They have a fear and a lack of confidence. So my repent, restore, and amend comes from the Catholic experience of confession. You have to repent, you have to be contrite, you want to change, you have to restore the damage you've caused, give back what you stole, for example, and amend the situation, not keep doing it. Next, please. Next slide. So repent, it means what is the problem? It is that the Native American tribes and other indigenous people have been devastated by European colonization with religious justification. While religious values were invoked, naively by some, and insincerely by psychopaths who just pretended that they believed these things, the driving values in most cases were greed, wealth, and empire. Even good people who tried to resist the oppression were hindered by unconscious biases, and we'll see that. So the first step is to admit the problem. And it goes way back into the early period with Islam. Here we have a picture of the original growth of Islam in the 7th century, and you can see how it pushed way into Europe. Next slide, please. Next slide. Hello. Next slide, please. There. And this is a little later. This is the Christian response pushing back with the Crusades, which caused all kinds of problems, as you can understand. The next slide, please. So in 1435, we're still, so at the end of the Crusades, and we're Islam is pushing in again. And so Pope Eugene came out with a document called Sicut Dudum, in which he tried to encourage Portugal and Spain to convert natives in the Canary Islands. These would be people who were not Muslim, were not Christian. But the problem was that pirates and slave traders were coming in and making slaves of these Canary Islanders, even the ones who had been converted to Christianity. So he came out with this document and saying that you can't do that with the Christians. If we've converted them, you can't make them slaves. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of Spain and Portugal and the Canary Islands there on the left off of Africa. Next. In 1452, another pope is trying to stop Muslim advances into Europe, and this was just a year before Constantinople fell to the Muslims. And he gave permission, we grant you, kings of Spain and Portugal, with our apostolic authority, full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens, that's the Muslims, and pagans, and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ, wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, duchies, counties, principalities, and other property, and reduce their persons to perpetual servitude. This was the donation. You see, he donated all these areas to the Portuguese and Spanish kings. Now, what we have here is a picture of the fall of Constantinople. You see how the Ottoman Empire has surrounded Constantinople. It's that little green area off on the left, or smaller states. Next slide, please. And this is a sort of a picture of the fall of Constantinople. Next, please. 1493, now the Constantinople has fallen, and this is the year after Columbus had first discovered the New World. Pope Alexander VI expands his permission from Muslims to these new areas to the west. Among other works, well-pleasing to the divine majesty. It's amazing how the Pope knew what was pleasing to the divine majesty. Cherished of our heart, this ranks highest, that the Catholic faith and Christian religion be exalted and everywhere increased and spread, the health of souls be cared for, and barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. Now that you have, this is summarizing, now that you've succeeded in driving the Muslims out of Grenada, out of Spain, now go out to the west. Next slide. We, by tenor of these presents, should any of said islands have been found by your envoys and captains, we give, grant, and assign to you and your heirs forever and successors, kings of Castile and Leon, together with all their dominions, cities, camps, places, villages, all rights, jurisdictions, and appurtenances, all islands and mainlands found and to be found, toward the west and south, and then he draws a line from the two poles, and he says, the Portuguese get everything to the east, and the Spanish get everything to the west. This was the donation. So long as the area has not been already seized by some other Christian prince. So the first finders keepers. Next slide. And this is a picture of what they knew, which wasn't very much. They knew that there was some seacoast over there, but they didn't have much idea how far it went. Next slide, please. Now, 1514, this would be what was read to the natives when you arrived in their land. And it would often be read in Spanish, Castilian Spanish, sometimes in translation. And you would announce to the natives the following: on behalf of the king and the queen, subjugators of barbarous people like you, we, their servants, notify and make known to you that God chose St. Peter to be the head of the entire human race, who gave your lands to the king of Spain. Consequently, we beseech and demand that you accept the church and recognize the Pope and acknowledge the king and queen as the lords of these islands and mainlands by virtue of the said donation. That's where we got this notion of a principle of donation. If you don't do it, we will enter your land against you with force, make war in every place, we'll subjugate you, put you to the authority of the yoke, we will make you slaves, we'll sell your children, dispose of you as they wish, and we'll take your property and do all the harm we can, as is done to vassals who will not obey their lord. Remember, this is still the period of lords and vassals, and everybody presumed they were under some lord or other, so all we're doing is changing their lord, that's all. And we avow that the deaths and harm you will receive will be your own blame, and not that of the king. Next, please. So the natives didn't always respond very well to this. Next slide, please. Now, Bartolomé de las Casas was one of the early settlers, but he saw what was going on and got quite disgusted by it. He was a friend of Columbus, and in fact, he edited Columbus's diary and published it. But in Latin America, he got disturbed. Next, please. And sent a letter, that's Bartolome. Next, please. Sent a letter to the king. Well, he actually wrote a book about what was going on. This is how the Spanish were responding. They mounted on generous steeds, lances and swords, exercised of bloody butcheries, spared no age, sex, not so much as women with child, ripping up the bellies, tore them alive in pieces, laid wagers who should at one blow divide or cut a man in two, who should behead a man with the greatest dexterity, and so on. Next, please. They snatch young babes from the mother's breast, dash their brains out on the rocks, throw them into rock. You can see this later on. Next, please. Erected gibbets to hold 13 people in honor of the 12 apostles and Jesus, blasphemously, and put fire underneath and burn them. And if they wanted to preserve them alive, they would cut their hands 2/3 off and have them hanging loose and send them into the forest to tell the people there what awaited them if they didn't give in. I'll just hold it. Next, please. And they would roast to some of their leaders with small fires. And one of them, they were making too much noise, and the man in charge said, please shut them up. No, he said, strangle them with a halter so that they don't make this noise. Next, please. But the executioner didn't want to do that, and so he stuffed gags into their mouths so you couldn't hear their screeching. Next, please. Now, I might admit that Bartolome wrote this in Spanish, and the British quickly translated it into English and distributed it up north in order to explain to people how barbarous those Spanish were. But you'll see a little later how the British responded. Next, please. There was a Dominican priest, several priests in today Dominican Republic and Haiti, who gave an Easter sermon against these practices. I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness. I who am the voice of Christ crying in the wilderness of this island. This voice declares that you are all in mortal sin, and you live and die therein by reason of the cruelty and tyranny you practice on this innocent people. Next, please. Next, please. Tell me by what right of justice you hold these Indians in such cruel and horrible slavery. By what right do you wage such detestable wars on these people who live mildly and peacefully in their own lands, where you have consumed infinite numbers of them with unheard of murders and desolations? Why do you so greatly oppress and fatigue them, not giving them enough to eat or caring for them when they fall into ill from excessive labor, so they die, or rather are slain by you, so that you may extract and acquire gold every day? Next, please. Why, what care do you have if they receive religious instruction? Are they not men? Do they not have rational souls? Are you not bound to love them as you love yourselves? Be sure that in your present state you can no more be saved than the Moors or Turks, who do not have and do not want the faith of Jesus Christ. This was a pretty powerful Easter or Lenten sermon. Next, please. The Spanish settlers so complained to the king. King complained to the Dominican superiors. Preachers were told to quit disturbing their flock, and were called back to Spain. Next, please. But the king was disturbed, and so he asked a theologian, Francesco di Vittoria, to study the matter. And Francesco concluded, number one, Indians are human beings. Now, there were people who were thinking that was not true. They're just animals. No, they are human beings. They do have the right to possess things, although some people denied that. They live in societies they have created. They have societies of their own. And the Pope has no power to give their lands to Europeans. But, of course, if they're eating each other and doing human sacrifice, that might be a reason to allow Europeans to take control. And, of course, we know Aztecs and Mayans did have human sacrifice. Next, please. That's a picture of De Vittoria. Next, please. When he became aware of the king's displeasure over the results of this study, he hedged a little more. Well, Indian culture is inferior, so they really ought to let the Spanish come and civilize them. It would be unreasonable for them to refuse the Spanish entry, and so if they interfere with the Spanish entry, the Spanish can reasonably attack and subdue them. Next, please. All right, now, Pope Paul III, 1537. This is a reverse of position. The Pope is starting to defend the locals. The Indians and all other peoples who may later be discovered are by no means to be deprived of their liberty or the possession of their property, even though they be outside the faith of Jesus Christ. They may and should freely and legitimately enjoy their liberty and the pursuit of their property, nor should they be in any way enslaved. Should the contrary happen, it should be null and have no effect. And they should be converted to the faith of Christ by preaching the word of God and by the example of good and holy living, not by violence. Next, please. Now, that's what he said. It doesn't mean that the settlers in the New World paid any attention to what he said. That was a long way away. All right, now the British in the North have talked about how nasty those Spanish were, but here's what they did in the North. The Pequot War that the Puritans led against the local Indians, writing about the war, one of them said, "And indeed such a dreadful terror of the Almighty let fall upon the spirit of the Indians, that they'd fly from us and run into the very flames where many of them perished. Thus they were now at their wits' end, who, not many hours before, exalted themselves in their great pride, threatening and resolving the utter ruin and destruction of all the English with exulting and rejoicing with songs and dances." Next, please. Next, please. "But God was above them, who left his enemies and the enemies of his people to scorn, making them as a fiery oven. Thus were the stout-hearted spoiled, having slept their last sleep, and none of their men could find their hands. Thus did the Lord judge among the heathen, filling the place with dead bodies." Next, please. "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who only doth wondrous things, and blessed be his holy name forever. Let the whole earth be filled with his glory. Thus the Lord was pleased to smite our enemies in the hinder parts, and give us their land for an inheritance." Does that sound familiar? Their land for an inheritance. "Who remembered us in our low estate and redeemed us out of our enemies' hands. Let us therefore praise the Lord for his goodness and his wonderful works to the children of men." Now, I think that's a statement of a psychopath who doesn't know what he's talking about. However, the U.S. Supreme Court has appealed to this discovery doctrine to justify the U.S. government's control over native lands. In 1823, their case was brought, and the government whose subjects explored, this court said that the government whose subjects explored and occupied a territory whose inhabitants were not subject to a European Christian monarch held legal title to that land. So England held it before us, and we've taken over from England, and so now we hold legal title. In 1831, with the Cherokee Nation, where Georgia wanted to move them off their land where they discovered gold, said, "Tribes are not independent states. They are domestic dependent states, related to the U.S. government as a ward is related to its guardian." The following year, the Supreme Court changed its mind and said, well, no, actually they are sovereign. And thus Georgia has no right to enforce state laws in the Cherokee territory. And the Indian Removal Act is invalid, illegal, unconstitutional, and violates treaties previously made by the U.S. But the president said, oh, this is a matter of states' rights. I have no right to interfere with the state of Georgia. And the state of Georgia removed the Cherokee to Oklahoma, and about 4,000 of the 17,000 died on the journey. Next. Next, please. Now, Christian missionaries did mitigate the worst effects, and we've seen some of that already. Bartolomé de las Casas reported their crimes to the king, helped to form native cooperative villages called encomiendas to protect the natives from slave traders. If you've seen the movie The Mission, you saw an example of Jesuit encomiendas or reducciones in Paraguay. But they were run paternalistically by the missioners. They were protecting the natives, but they were also teaching them Western ways, and then treated the natives like children and suppressed their culture. Next. Next, please. Junipero Serra in California, who has just been named a saint, ran similar native missions in California. The Anglican Bishop Benjamin Whipple in our area in Minnesota interceded with Lincoln to review the death sentences after the Dakota Uprising of 1863, when over, a couple hundred were condemned to death, and Lincoln reduced it to 39 and then 38. It's still the largest public hanging in U.S. history at New Ulm. And Bishop Whipple approved of settlers seizing Dakota lands because he thought if we give them less land, then they'll have to learn how to farm. Next, please. Well, attitudes have begun to change. Next. 1965, Second Vatican Council. Religious communities have the right not to be hindered in their public teaching and witness to their faith by spoken or written word. In spreading religious faith and introducing religious practices, everyone ought at all times to refrain from any manner of action which might seem to carry a hint of coercion. Have you noticed a hint of coercion in any of what the preceding there? Or a kind of persuasion that would be dishonorable, unworthy, especially when dealing with poor, uneducated people. Such manner of action would have to be considered an abuse of one's right and a violation of the right of others. Next, please. It's one of the major tenets of Catholic doctrine that a human response to God and faith must be free. No one is to be forced to embrace the Christian faith against his own will. Next. Another document, same council, Declaration on the Relation of Church to Non-Christian Religions. Religions found everywhere. Now, this would include native religions. Try to encounter the restlessness of human heart, each in its own manner, by proposing ways comprising teachings, rules of life, and sacred rites. The Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in these religions. Now, the trick here is, what is considered true and holy? Doesn't mean the Catholic Church rejects nothing in these religions, just nothing that's true and holy. She regards with sincere reverence those ways of conduct and of life, those precepts and teachings, which, though differing in many ways from the one she holds and sets forth, nevertheless often reflect a ray of that truth which enlightens all men. Next, please. The Church therefore exhorts her sons through dialogue and collaboration with the followers of other religions, carried out with prudence and love, and a witness to the Christian faith and life. They recognize, preserve, and promote the good things, spiritual and moral, as well as the socio-cultural values found among these humans. The Church reproves as foreign to the mind of Christ any discrimination against humans or harassment of them because of their race, color, condition of life, or religion. Next, please. Now, confession is important. We not only need to say the right way to act, we need to look in the past and say we made some mistakes. In 1999, an International Theological Commission under the direction of Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger said the following: another sad chapter of history to which the sons and daughters of the Church must return with the spirit of repentance is that of the acquiescence given, especially in certain centuries, to intolerance and even the use of force in the service of religion. Next. This refers to forms of evangelization that employed improper means to announce the revealed truth, or did not include an evangelical discernment suited to the cultural values of peoples, or did not respect the consciences of the persons to whom the faith was presented, as well as all forms of force used in the repression and correction of errors. This is a man who was had been the head of the Doctrinal Commission. Next, please. Although Pope John Paul II, St. John Paul II now, apologized publicly in 2000 for the sins of the Church, many indigenous people think his apologies were not specific enough. They want the Catholic Church to repudiate earlier decrees, specifically to say we now reject the statement of Pope so-and-so in such and such a statement. Now, I had completed this talk when Thursday night I happened to open the New York Times and discover this statement from Pope Francis just last Thursday. Some may rightly say when the Pope speaks of colonialism, he overlooks certain actions of the Church. I say this to you with regret. Many grave sins were committed against the native people of America in the name of God. I humbly ask forgiveness, not only for the offense of the Church herself, but also for crimes committed against the native peoples during the so-called conquest of America. And that's just 2 days old. All right, so this is all confess, recognize. Now next we want to restore. How do we restore what was stolen? Maybe we could start by respecting the treaties. And I draw attention to the White Earth Land Reclamation Project as one example where the White Earth tribe is piece by piece buying back their reservation, which got lost through various forms of trickery and people going into bankruptcy and losing the land. I also might suggest we need to rebalance resources and opportunities, but through dialogue, not dictation. It's not our part to tell the Native Americans how we should fix this. We need to talk with them and share their culture and ask them what they want and what's important to them. An example, I suggest a Native American bill similar to the GI Bill after the Second World War. Supposing the U.S. government were to offer every Native American kid a free university education. However, we would need to be talking with the natives what kind of education, not just you're free to come and learn our way, but what kind of education would you like the government to finance for your kids? That's just an example. Another would be encouraging Native organizations, as the government in the 30s did some encouraging of unionizing. But those are just a few thoughts. Now, dialogue presumes that both sides have something to offer. The Professor George Tinker, who's an Osage Indian, points out that even with the best of intentions, missionaries like John Eliot, Junipero Serra, and John de Smet, and Henry Whipple cooperated in destroying native culture, unconsciously distorting their preaching to fit European biases. And he calls it cultural genocide. Do Christians need then to forgo evangelization because it's culturally destructive? Should we not talk about Jesus to natives? Next slide, please. Would natives prefer to be left alone to maintain their cultures without interference? Or would such a limitation itself be paternalistic? Should we be saying, well, we don't want to tell you about what we've seen, you keep what you have? Shouldn't natives be allowed to decide for themselves what aspects of other cultures they would like to incorporate? For example, horses were brought to the Americas by the Spanish. They were European invention. But Plains Indians adapted them so successfully that most people today imagine that a horse-centered culture is authentically native. It's actually borrowing from the natives, from the invaders. Next. There's still space, I suggest, for sharing the gospel so long as we are open to receiving as well, and we respect the integrity of our dialogue partner. It's important to realize ways that our sharing is culturally narrow. Inculturation encourages the indigenous themselves to shape the way they incorporate what we suggest. They want it, they don't want it. What do they want to do with it? The Dakota medicine man Black Elk is an example. Some of you may know the book Black Elk Speaks. If you do, you may not be aware that the book stops short in his life. It deliberately chooses not to mention that the last almost half century of his life, he was a Roman Catholic catechist. He wanted that included in the book, but Niemann, the editor, did not want it because he wanted Black Elk presented as the last of the native healers and sort of sitting there on the mountain overlooking the loss of his culture. But what about that? The question then is raised, was Black Elk's conversion genuine, or was he just trying to get along? And there's quite an argument among scholars about that. And Damian Costello suggests this. Yes, his conversion was genuine, as his family insists, his daughter, but it was not a conversion to the Western Christianity of his time as it was being practiced to control the world. Rather, it was a conversion to the true original Catholic Christianity that was judging the greedy, violent Christians who were destroying the lives and cultures of other people. It would be like Gandhi, who said, oh, I love Jesus. I'd love to meet a Christian. I can't find one. Or like they said to him, Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization? He said, oh, I think that would be a wonderful idea. Wakantanka is the same God for everyone. He came to rescue the poor from the greed, violence, and oppression of the rich. And so amending now. What do we do? How do we amend? First of all, don't support psychopaths. You have to identify who they are, what they're doing. You know, spreading democracy. You know, it was spreading Christianity, now it's spreading democracy. Don't continue dispossessing. Take personal steps to undo the effects of past dispossession. Figure out how to rebalance and redistribute resources. We're not going to go back to 100 or 200 years ago, but what we do need is to balance the resources and the burdens of life fairly between all the humans living here. Whether they're native or not native, they ought to have the same level of resources everyone else has, in whatever form that takes. Okay, so don't continue dispossessing. These are a few examples of how we are still dispossessing. Uranium mining, South Pacific nuclear testing is not going on now, but still underground testing. All of our nuclear tests have been on native land. Every nuclear test. Pimachicamac Indians in Manitoba, the Manitoba Hydro has been flooding them out. Alaska Prudhoe-based bill, Latin American imperialism, what the Pope was talking about, other indigenous groups, other disadvantaged groups. Today we can add in also the tar sands in Canada. So here's uranium mining. Next, please. South Pacific nuclear testing in Bikini Atoll. Manitoba Hydro, Pimachicamac environment. The water goes up, goes down, goes up, goes down. Alaska Prudhoe Bay oil spill. Next. So Pope Francis, on his recent encyclical on the environment, the human environment and the natural environment deteriorate together. We can't adequately combat environmental degradation unless we attend to causes related to human and social degradation. In fact, the deterioration of the environment and of society affects the most vulnerable people on the planet. Both everyday experience and scientific research show that the gravest effects of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest. We can note the rise of a false or superficial ecology which bolsters, I love this, complacency and a cheerful recklessness. As often occurs in periods of deep crisis, which require bold decisions, we're tempted to think what's happening is not entirely clear. Specifically, superficially, apart from a few obvious signs of pollution and deterioration, things don't look that serious, and the planet could continue as it is for some time. Such evasiveness serves as a license to carry on with our present lifestyles and models of production and consumption. This is the way human beings contrive to feed their self-destructive vices, trying not to see them, trying not to acknowledge them, delaying the important decisions, and pretending that nothing will happen. Don't tell me that this Pope doesn't know how to speak clearly. Finally, there's some personal steps we can take to undo the effect of past dispossession. Well, we can study the matter. We can try to understand our cultural differences, not just to say, oh, that's interesting, cultural differences, but to say, oh, that's interesting. Now, you know, can I learn about that? Make Native friends. How many of us have Native American friends? Discover some. Adopt a family. Supposing every Minnesota family had adopted a Native family as their friend and helped to support them, help their kids to get through school and so on, it'd be interesting. And support justice. All right, this is an example of the New Ulm Diocese mission in San Lucas, Toliman, Guatemala. I was down there in '88, and somebody said, oh, come here, Dave, look at this. I went into his room, and the kids were trying to see what was going on. You know, new strangers, let's see what's going on. They climb up on the window to see. So these are Guatemalan Indian kids. And the final picture, if you want to learn more about things, I do have a book with Liza Burr and her husband John. Landgraf is here today, Understanding World Religions. And there's a chapter on Native American worldviews. So that's the presentation. I think we're ready for questions, comments. Do we want to use the microphone for questions? Yes. Yes. Could you come up to the microphone, please? There's two of you there.
Thanks for stopping by and talking. I've got a question about genocide, and from what I understand, genocide doesn't necessarily need to be the complete extermination of a population of people.
That's correct.
It can include, the destroying of their values, of their history, of their architecture, et cetera. And I keep running into comparisons between Native American history and what the Israelis are doing in Palestine right now. What they're doing in Palestine, some people say, is slow, incremental genocide. Even though the Palestinians are able to keep having more babies than the Israelis are killing, some people say, well, that's not really genocide. But in my understanding, just because they're not killing more, it still seems like genocide because they're restricting their freedom, they're taking away their civilization, their culture, their way of life. So if you would just talk a little bit about a working definition of genocide that doesn't necessarily stop at mass murder.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a wonderful question, and it's one I'm very much interested in. That's why I've spent 4 months on peace teams in West Bank and Gaza. It's quite true. It is a form of genocide. If you look at the actual definition of genocide, which is a United Nations definition, we have it right at the very end of this book. I have a little section on genocide and give the definition, and I give examples of genocide, starting with Native American, and then the Armenian genocide, and then like Cambodia and several others, and the last one I mentioned is the Palestinian genocide, because as you say, it's an attempt to erase the history of a people. Israel is going through eliminating villages, bulldozing villages, planning. When they say we've planted trees all through, we've made Israel green. What they've done is they planted trees on the remains of villages they bulldozed. And they planted non-indigenous trees that sop up a lot of water, which is not a good thing in a very dry climate. And they had a forest fire recently there because these trees are not very stable. So a lot of things going on, but they rename villages, so they eliminate the history as much as they can. They've just built a new museum of tolerance on top of a Muslim cemetery, which doesn't sound very tolerant. So a lot of things, there's some very, very serious difficulties. And I would say, yes, the definition of genocide includes this kind of erasure of a people's history. And genocide does not have to, you don't have to kill everybody for it to be considered a genocide. Now, you get into the question, how does that compare to the Holocaust, where it does appear that Hitler's intention was to kill every Jew. And that doesn't seem to be the intention here. The intention seems to be to destroy the culture so that people who are not Jews will not have a reason to want to live here. We get them out. In a generation or two, they'll forget all about it. And then we'll be just us, Jews. Well, I do point out that there's a few problems with that, and one of them, we look at examples of it from the past. The Puritans had a good deal like that going in Massachusetts, but it didn't last. The Catholics had a good deal like going in the middle of Italy called the Papal States, but it didn't last. These things don't last because the kids don't always follow what the parents believed. And things are not, you can't keep going that way forever. I have some more questions.
A comment and a question. It occurred to me when you were talking about some of the more gentle forms of persuasion when we came to the point of allowing Native people to come to the gospel on their own. To me, that's just another form of paternalism and attempting to convert people in a more subtle way. I mean, if Native people were to turn around and try to convert Christians to their belief system, the outrage would be just outrage. It would just be the outrage would be unbelievable on the part of Christians. And so there's still, still see that element of somehow we are better and he wants you to come to us. Mm-hmm. And then the question I have is, under Vatican II, I know that there was a lot of controversy over some of the aspects of Vatican II. Was this aspect of Vatican II that you presented, was there a lot of controversy around that?
There was controversy when it was being discussed. And particularly there was controversy on the part of some of the Middle Eastern Christians because it originally started as a statement on Jews, and a positive statement on Jews. And some of the people in the Middle East said, this is not dealing with the real problems here that the Zionist Jews are causing. There was that kind of controversy. I think what you say is true in terms of how people share and present. And if people really do come together and say, look, here's what I've discovered, tell me what you've discovered, let's see what we can learn together. How can we enrich each other? That's not, of course, the way it's normally done. And there are a number of Christians who will come and, are you saved? Have you given your life to Jesus? You've got to give your life to Jesus or you go to hell. Maybe that's not the way to start, right? I don't know that natives approach us that way, you know. If you've given your life to Wakantanka, if you don't, you'll go to the unhappy hunting grounds. But, I mean, there's a lot to be learned from the native culture, and particularly that's one of the things that Pope Francis just said, that we need to learn from the cultures here in Latin America that pre-existed the Christian culture. On the other hand, I don't think I want to say that people who have made an exciting discovery shouldn't mention it to anyone else. It's a question of how you mention it. And is it really a matter of, look, I've discovered this, what do you think? Or is it a matter of, oh, you better see it my way or you're in trouble? Anyway, this could be argued a long time. Another question? Yeah.
Thank you so much. I was really happy to get the information that you gave. I wanted to mention that in terms of seizure of lands, right now northern Minnesota and Wisconsin are a prime location. The pipelines are to go through ricing fields, traditional territories, and everything. And so if people are moved to do something, it's not too far away. You don't
Yes.
have to go to British Columbia.
Very good. Thank you very much. An example again. The problem is ongoing, and there's something we can do about it.
I'm a traditional social activist, so I always relate to that. And actually, this is a lot about that. When you first started, I thought you were going to talk about a kind of Christian experience that gave people the strength to grieve and begin that exploration. Do you know of anywhere that Christianity is really profoundly doing the process you talked about when you started? You know, because you can go out and do stuff, but you know, then you're kind of out every direction. It's almost like the internal part of it doesn't seem to be addressed.
I might draw your attention to Archbishop Romero.
Okay.
And you know that Pope Francis, when he was Archbishop in Argentina,
Yeah.
he was Jesuit and then was Archbishop. Initially, he was concerned about what was called liberation theology.
Yeah.
He thought it was going too far in certain areas. He tried to slow things down a bit. And he was also dealing with a period when the government was running amok and was seizing people and taking them out in helicopters and dumping them into the ocean and things like that. And he did make some serious efforts to rescue some priests who were captured, but there's been some criticism that he could have done more. As time went on, he became more and more converted. And,
That sounds like the leadership.
that's the leadership.
I'm kind of
The
talking
people,
about the grassroots people Christianity.
well, let's say in Latin America, the grassroots people Christianity in some countries were the indigenous. You know,
How
5
about
countries
here?
like in Guatemala.
Yeah.
Here, grassroots people are, what did I say at the beginning? Most people will go along with the psychopaths because they don't know that much. They're busy with other things. They don't know that it makes much difference. They don't know much about it. And they want to trust their leaders. So there's a lot of sort of slowness to get around to realize what's going on. But there's lots of places you could plug in. And liberation theology is one of them, and looking at, because Pope Francis now is sort of reviving liberation theology. And in fact, he invited Gustavo Gutierrez to the Vatican, one of the first things he did. Gustavo was the man who wrote the book called A Theology of Liberation and gave the movement its name. And he was under a cloud for quite a while. But Gustavo and the current head of the Council for the Teaching of the Faith, which had put pressure on some of the liberation theologians, the two of them together have written a book on liberation theology. So things are warming up, are loosening up, but it takes a long time. Part of the problem, of course, in Latin America is similar to part of the problem here, and that's a question. You're a bishop, you're a priest, you're a pastor, you've got a church. You have to pay for the heat, you have to keep the roof in shape. You depend on people who have enough money to make contributions to help keep things running. And so there is a tendency, therefore, for the leadership to side with the ones who are supporting them. And that's a difficult thing. In the early church, of course, they didn't have that. You didn't have big churches. You'd meet in somebody's home, you meet in a cave somewhere or something, meet out in a secret area. But these, I don't know. Another question. Very good questions. Yes?
Maybe I can see it from here. Isn't that an argument for what's happening today in the churches where youth are not finding it attractive? That for the churches or for people who believe that the church needs a different form, that going into intentional communities, having less bricks and mortar to protect, would let church leaders be, if we have to give them an out, get them out of having to protect all this building and have less buildings and fewer buildings. And
So what you're suggesting is that the youth themselves are open to the notion of something that's less established on brick and mortar, intentional communities, neighborhood communities, and so on. There's movements like this all over, and there have been throughout 2,000 years of the church. Think of Francis of Assisi and his movement in the Middle Ages. Think of the rise of the monastic orders, where people just went out into the rural area and set up little communes, basically what they were. We have a Benedictine commune in Minnesota. It's called St. John's at Collegeville. It happens to be the largest Benedictine commune in the world, at least the last I heard. But and we have charismatic renewal. We have all kinds of, we have liberation theology, peace and justice groups. So it's true that, how would I put it? A lot of people are born into a faith. They grow up in a faith. They take it for granted. They don't think that much about it. They don't know that much about it. But if you ask them, they'll say, oh yeah, I'm Lutheran, I'm Catholic, I'm Anglican, I'm whatever, I'm Baptist. But they don't know much about it. But when people discover what's about it, and it begins to be real to them, it's quite different. They get quite excited, and they're less concerned about buildings and more concerned about people and movement and relationship and so on, and it makes a huge difference. So right now, the church in the Twin Cities, as you know, is in bankruptcy, and so we're having to think about what you do with fewer material resources too. We don't know where that's going to end up. Question here? Steve.
Actually, I wanted to respond to the previous question about what individuals can do. In Canada recently, they just finished a period of time with a truth and reconciliation process. There's an organization called Kairos, I think it's out of Toronto, that was coordinating a lot of the Christian churches, but it was basically investigating the role that churches had played in their residential boarding schools, trying to strip Native Indigenous people of their cultures and their values. And so this Truth and Reconciliation process heard a lot of testimony, and there's still a lot of work to be done, but that's one model that can be copied here in the U.S., and that's the complicity of the church in stripping the culture away. And so I'd encourage you just to Google Kairos Canada, and you can find out a lot more about that whole Truth and Reconciliation process. But truth-telling is one of the most important things that we can begin to do in this process.
Yes.
Kairos.
Now, there are several, Kairos refers to several different statements, and it's based on the Barman Revolution in the time of the Nazism, when some Protestants in Germany came out with a statement about this is a time to stand up and face the problem. The primary Kairos document today is from Palestinians. It's a time to face the issue of Israel-Palestine. There's also a Kairos USA document, which is a response to the Kairos Jerusalem document. And then this one in Canada would be extending that into Native. And it is interesting because this has come up, as soon as we talked about this relation of the natives, it came up, the relation with Palestinians, because it really is very parallel. It's a group moving in on another group, the group they're moving in on, largely tribal. The Palestinian culture was largely family-based, tribal-based at the time of 1900 when the Zionists started moving in and taking over. So there's a lot, and this sense of righteousness about it. God gave us this land, or we are the new holy people in this land. This is the new Canaan. The Puritans came across with that sense. Europe is defunct. Europe is corrupt. Now we're starting the new Holy Land here in this new land. Of course, it had to leave out the natives, and it had to leave out the slaves, and a number of other people.
How available are you to make these presentations?
I'm available to make these presentations anytime if we can get a schedule.
Good. I know where you are.
Say your email or your phone number.
My email is D as in David, W Smith, D.W. Smith at St. Thomas. There's no T, but no dot between the Saint and the Thomas. STTHOMAS .edu. D.W. Smith at stthomas.edu.
Thank you, and I appreciate your broad range of knowledge and conveying that here today. I want to bring up another point of information because there has been a apology to the Native Americans by the U.S. government. A lot of people may not know that. This president and the Congress actually apologized and buried it inside one of about 2009, 2010, the National Defense Appropriations Act. Mm-hmm. So there is a tool that someday will come out and we'll finally have a method of getting towards that, but it's been formally recognized that there was a genocide in this country by U.S. governments.
Yes. It takes a while, The large genocide was the late 1800s, 19th century, and the Armenian genocide was the early 20th century. The Turkey has not yet come around to the point of admitting, and the ongoing genocide in Palestine, of course, is ongoing. So, and then these other, it's true, there have been other genocides like Rwanda and Cambodia, Iraq, yeah.